February 1947, Havana, Cuba. By Monday morning, Frank Sinatra's name appeared in FBI files linking him to the most powerful mobster in American history. By Tuesday, newspaper headlines screamed about the crooner carrying a briefcase stuffed with $2 million in cash. By Friday, his reputation as America's romantic voice was permanently tangled with organized crime. It started with a phone call inviting him to the most dangerous party in the Western Hemisphere, a gathering where mob bosses divided an empire, and Sinatra sang for his supper. Don't forget to subscribe to Frank Sinatra, The Untold Empire, and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. The invitation came through the right channels. Frank Costello made the call personally, not a request, more like a courtesy between friends. Sinatra, at 31, had reached a strange inflection point in his career. The Bobby Soxer hysteria was fading. Teen girls who'd screamed for him in 1943 were now married with children of their own. Radio was changing. Television loomed on the horizon. And Sinatra, always sensitive to shifting winds, knew he needed new allies, new respect, new power bases. The mob offered all three. He'd known these men for years. Willie Moretti had helped him escape Tommy Dorsey's contract back in 1942. Frank Costello had smoothed problems in New York. These weren't strangers. They were the men who'd helped build his career when legitimate Hollywood power brokers had dismissed him as just another skinny Italian kid from Hoboken. Now they wanted him in Cuba for a week. A vacation, they said. Some sun, some music, some cards. Sinatra knew better. This wasn't vacation. This was an audition for something bigger. He flew commercial to Miami, then caught a private charter to Havana on February 11, 1947. Cuba before Castro was America's playground. Casinos, rum, music, women, and enough corrupt officials to make anything possible. Batista's government looked the other way as American mobsters poured money into hotels and casinos, transforming Havana into Las Vegas before Vegas existed. Sinatra checked into the Hotel Nacional, the jewel of the Havana skyline, where every room held secrets and every hallway whispered with conspiracy. The first night, he performed. Not a concert, just singing at a private party, intimate and informal. The audience wasn't teenagers. It was men in expensive suits smoking Cuban cigars, men who controlled unions and casinos and politicians, men who'd killed and ordered killings and would again without hesitation. Sinatra sang night and day, and I've got you under my skin. They applauded politely. This wasn't about the music. This was about respect, about showing he belonged in their world, about proving Frank Sinatra wasn't just a microphone singer, but a man who understood the rules of power. Then someone mentioned that Lucky Luciano was in Havana. Sinatra's eyes flickered with recognition. Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who'd reorganized the American Mafia in the 1930s, who'd been convicted and imprisoned, then deported to Italy after World War II. Officially, Luciano was banned from American soil forever. But Cuba wasn't American soil. And in February 1947, Havana hosted the largest gathering of mob leaders since Prohibition ended. The Havana Conference, where the Commission would decide the future of organized crime in America. Sinatra knew what this meant. He was in Cuba during the most important mob meeting in a generation. This wasn't coincidence. They'd invited him here during this specific week for a reason. He was entertainment, yes, but he was also a test. Could Frank Sinatra be trusted? Could the voice, beloved by millions, photographed constantly, famous beyond measure, keep his mouth shut about what he saw and who he met? Lucky Luciano held court at the Hotel Nacional's suite like an exiled king receiving courtiers. Mob bosses flew in from across America: Vito Genovese from New York, Carlos Marcello from New Orleans, Santo Traficante from Tampa, Meyer Lansky orchestrating from the shadows. They brought briefcases full of cash, tributes to Luciano, investments in Cuban casinos, payments for territorial rights back home. The amount staggered. Some estimated $4 to $5 million changed hands that week. The Havana Conference wasn't chaos. It was business conducted with the precision of a corporate board meeting. Behind closed doors in Luciano's suite, mob leaders divided America into territories. Narcotics routes were established. Casino profits were allocated. Disputes were settled with votes instead of violence, though everyone understood that violence remained the final arbiter if anyone broke the agreements made in that Havana hotel room. Sinatra wasn't present for these meetings, but he saw the men coming and going. He understood what was happening. When Sinatra met Luciano, witnesses later recalled the moment with precise detail. According to those present, Sinatra approached with deference, a quality he rarely showed anyone. The crooner who'd told off studio executives and walked out on rehearsals stood before the deported mob boss with something close to reverence. Years later, participants claimed Luciano greeted him warmly, as one Sicilian to another, as one man who'd conquered America to another who'd been forced to leave it. They spoke Italian. They talked about Sicily, about family, about respect. The question that haunted investigators for decades: did Sinatra bring money to Luciano? The briefcase allegation emerged almost immediately. Sources told the FBI that Sinatra carried a suitcase or briefcase containing anywhere from $1 to $2 million in cash, delivered personally to Lucky Luciano as a gift or investment from mob interests back home. Sinatra denied this categorically and consistently until his death. The FBI investigated but never proved it. The truth, lost somewhere between legend and reality, remains disputed. What's undeniable: Sinatra spent a week in Havana while the mob divided America. He attended parties where mob bosses made decisions that would shape organized crime for the next 20 years. He sang for them. He drank with them. He laughed at their jokes and listened to their stories. And when he flew back to Miami on February 19, 1947, he carried something more valuable than cash. He carried their trust. The FBI noticed immediately. J. Edgar Hoover's agents had been watching the Havana Conference, photographing arrivals, tracking meetings, documenting the mob's reorganization. Sinatra's presence didn't go unnoticed. On February 20, 1947, just 2 days after Sinatra returned, the FBI opened a file on Frank Sinatra. It would grow to 1,275 pages over the next 4 decades. The Havana trip was page 1. FBI surveillance began in earnest. Agents documented Sinatra's phone calls, his restaurant reservations, his nightclub appearances. They interviewed his associates, pressured his friends, cultivated informants within his circle. Hoover, obsessed with mob connections and suspicious of Italian Americans in entertainment, saw Sinatra as a perfect target, famous enough to matter, connected enough to be dangerous, and arrogant enough to make mistakes. Then the press caught wind. Gossip columnist Lee Mortimer, who'd feuded with Sinatra for years, broke the story in the New York Daily Mirror. "Sinatra entertains mobsters in Havana," screamed the headline. Suddenly, America's romantic crooner, the voice that had serenaded millions through World War II, was linked publicly to Lucky Luciano and organized crime. Radio stations received angry letters. Sponsors grew nervous. The Catholic Church, always influential in Italian-American communities, questioned whether Sinatra was an appropriate role model. Sinatra's response followed his pattern: fury and denial. According to press reports from the era, he called the allegations lies and character assassination. He claimed he'd gone to Cuba on vacation, happened to see some people he knew socially, sang a few songs at parties, and came home. As for Lucky Luciano, Sinatra maintained he'd met the man once, briefly, didn't know who he was at first, and certainly hadn't delivered any briefcase full of money. Years later, in congressional testimony, he'd stick to this story with minor variations, but the damage was done. The Havana trip marked Sinatra permanently. Before Cuba, his mob connections were rumors and gossip. After Cuba, they were documented by the FBI, reported in newspapers, and discussed in Hollywood boardrooms. Directors who'd been considering Sinatra for film roles suddenly found other actors. Radio sponsors reconsidered contracts. The Bobby Soxer audience had already been fading. Now the adult audience questioned whether they wanted their daughters listening to a man who palled around with deported mob bosses. His marriage to Nancy suffered. She'd stayed home in California with their children, while Frank flew to Cuba for a vacation. When headlines about Lucky Luciano exploded across newspapers, Nancy Sinatra read them like everyone else. According to friends from that period, she confronted Frank about the trip. He dismissed her concerns, told her it was nothing, told her the press was lying. She wanted to believe him, but doubt, once planted, grows. The Havana trip became another crack in a marriage already strained by Frank's ambition and infidelities. Hollywood's attitude shifted subtly but significantly. Studio executives who'd courted Sinatra now hesitated. The mob was one thing when it stayed in the shadows. Everyone knew certain clubs had connections, certain favors required certain friendships, but Havana made it public. Sinatra's name in the same sentence as Lucky Luciano created problems for studios trying to maintain wholesome images. MGM, which had Sinatra under contract, began looking for ways to minimize his roles. His career entered a slow decline. Not immediately, the Havana trip alone didn't destroy Frank Sinatra. But it was the first crack. In 1947, he was still a star. By 1948, his popularity was slipping. By 1949, MGM was losing interest. By 1950, his voice would hemorrhage and Columbia Records would drop him. The Havana trip wasn't the cause of all this collapse, but it was the warning sign. The moment when Sinatra's mob connections stopped being colorful background and became career-threatening liability. The mob, meanwhile, remembered Havana differently. To them, Sinatra had passed the test. He'd shown up when invited. He'd entertained without asking questions. He'd kept his mouth shut afterward, never confirming details to press or investigators. In the world of organized crime, that loyalty meant everything. When Sinatra's career collapsed in 1952, when he was broke and desperate, the mob remembered Cuba. They helped him get the role in From Here to Eternity. They made calls. They applied pressure. They took care of their own. And from that day on, Frank Sinatra lived with the weight of Havana. The FBI file that started with that 1947 trip never closed. J. Edgar Hoover's agents followed Sinatra for 40 years, wiretapping his phones, surveilling his homes, documenting his friendships. Gaming authorities in Nevada would later cite the Cuba trip when they investigated his casino licenses. Congressional committees would ask about it decades later. Biographers would debate the briefcase for generations. Sinatra learned the essential paradox that would define his life. He was America's romantic voice, the crooner who sang love songs that made women weep. But he was also the kid from Hoboken who'd needed help from dangerous men to escape Tommy Dorsey's contract, who'd needed mob muscle to open doors Hollywood kept closed to skinny Italians. He wanted respect in both worlds, the legitimate stage and the shadowy underworld. Havana proved you couldn't have both without consequences. The briefcase haunted him. In interviews throughout his life, whenever reporters dared ask about Cuba, Sinatra's temper flared. He'd storm out of press conferences. He'd threaten lawsuits. He'd call reporters every obscene name in his considerable vocabulary. The fury suggested either absolute innocence or absolute guilt. No one could tell which. What's certain, the allegation wounded him deeply. He wanted to be seen as a legitimate artist, not a mob courier. Lucky Luciano never returned to America. He died in Naples in 1962, still exiled, still powerful in his way, still remembered as the man who'd organized the American Mafia. Frank Sinatra lived another 51 years, sang another 1,000 songs, married 4 times, made 60 films, won Oscars and Grammys and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But he never escaped the shadow of that February week in Cuba when he'd chosen which world he belonged to. The briefcase remained legend. No one ever proved Sinatra carried $2 million to Lucky Luciano. No one ever proved he didn't. What's certain is simpler and sadder. In February 1947, Frank Sinatra wanted respect from men who controlled America from its shadows. He got that respect. The price was a 175-page FBI file and a question that would follow him to his grave. Whose side are you really on, Frank? The answer, as always with Sinatra, was complicated. He was on his own side. Always. And that meant being friends with anyone who could help him stay on top, whether they wore tuxedos to the Academy Awards or ordered murders in between courses of pasta and wine.